Hey people, now I'm going to start out this video by drawing your attention to something. They're called Blip stories. Now these aren't stories that come from Qanon, barf, and whatever else not. They're stories that come from news organizations like BBC, CNN, MSNBC, and other credible news organizations, not Fox News. What they are their fillers, more or less. Back in August of 2019, it was either MSNBC or CNN that used a blip story about a new virus in China. And that's how I know Trump knew that COVID already existed long before it got to America. Because it wasn't until 2018? No, it was 2019, and then 2020, March of 2020, is when the virus started really spreading through America. But in that Blip story, they reported on a new virus in China. They mused on whether or not it would come to America. And this was back in August of 2019. It might have even been late July, but it was back then. And then it vanished until about January of 2020. Then it became a huge story. It was either January or February. And it became a huge story because COVID was coming this way. And I had mentioned the news report on a couple of either comments or posts that I seen back then. And people were laughing at me. Now, during the BLM protests, there was another blip story. It was about how the FBI had found that a white supremacist group on their white supremacist page had posted a supposed antifa flyer calling for antifa members to start going to places like Minneapolis and all these other BLM protests and start riots. Now, I had mentioned this. I have mentioned it on and off ever since then. And people, both on Democrat and Republican side, laugh at me for it. They laugh at me for it. They laughed at me for it. That's a bunch of bunk. That's a bunch of bull. I don't know where you're getting your information. From a blip story, a filler that was reported from MSNBC, BBC, CNN, or one of those channels. But I caught it and I picked up on it. Back when they were lighting the fire department on fire in Minneapolis. Okay? It was just before that I had picked up on that. Guess what they found today? 31 white supremacists were arrested for planning a riot at the March for Your Life rallies. Now, my blip story isn't such a blip anymore, is it? And that's why these news organizations do these blip stories as fillers. Because they're stories that can become something, but they're nothing yet. So they're not going to report much on it until it does become something. So then they can take credit and say, oh yeah, our news organization mentioned that way back when. Yeah. They made one short mention of it. It may have been a few seconds of a story, a blip, a filler, something most people don't pay attention to. And then they moved on and never mentioned it again until it actually blew up so that they could take credit. I pay attention to those blip stories. I pay close attention to those blip stories. Because 9 times out of 10, or a lot of the time, even 50% of the time, those blip stories become something. Sometimes it's not big and sensational. Sometimes it's only localized. But they do become something more than just that blip. It just depends on how much more they become than that blip, on whether or not it ends up being a large news story hitting all news organizations, or whether it's small enough that it only hits localized news organizations. But they are important, and you need to pay attention to them. Stop ignoring them. Because one of these days, a blip story is going to come across. You're going to ignore it. And then you're going to be shocked when the big thing actually hits. And it will hit. And stop laughing at people like me for mentioning these blip stories. We're mentioning them to try and draw your attention to it, so that you won't be shocked when 31 white supremacists are arrested for planning a riot at a March for Our Life rally. Lord knows what they were planning. Weapons and everything. Were they planning on going in there and shooting that rally up and more people dead? Would have that been sensational enough for you to pay attention to finally? Or would it just be just not enough? Start paying attention, people. Start paying attention. The blip stories are important. Maybe not big enough right now. But come the future, they may be just big enough for the world to pay attention to. Or they may be just big enough for your local area to start paying attention to. But pay attention. And I'm not talking about paying attention to QAnon and these conspiracy theories. I'm talking about paying attention to blip stories that come directly out of credible news organizations. Not ones that come out of things like Fox News, QAnon, and Breitbart. Pay attention, people. Pay attention.